Marokkaan to do.
Okay. All right. Hello, Conrad.
Hello, Siki.
Wait, let me. Good morning, Conrad. Steenkamp, how are you doing this morning?
I'm fine.
Great. My name is Siki Langa. I am the coordinator of the Indigenous Languages Action Forum, otherwise known as ILAF. And Conrad, you might have seen him all over the news during Ryanair talking about Afrikaans, since he is on the Afrikaans Language Council. We are also very privileged because Conrad is also a part of ILAF, which is wonderful, which is why what made him such a wonderful advocate for all languages in South Africa during that time. So, Conrad, will you please share with us just your experience during that time and what was really highlighted to you with the whole Ryanair Afrikaans drama?
Yes, well, the first was complete astonishment, utter astonishment, that a company would use Afrikaans, or for that matter, any language, in this way. I mean, linguistically, it makes no sense whatsoever. You can't use language to determine somebody's nationality. It makes no sense whatsoever. It really indicates it's not professional. Ryanair made a big mistake, even trying to use language in this way.
And how has this made, with the whole language equality, which Dr. Zakira Doctorate spoke so often about on the news, especially when she was talking about just the whole situation in the court system, with language, the use of, where other languages are underprivileged and not used and not really taken seriously in courts, when we have 11 official languages. So in terms of language equality, how would you say that this has done? Like, has this frustrated your work? Has this assisted your position to be able to explain how you're advocating for all languages rather than the negative effects that this Ryanair questionnaire was causing, where Afrikaans was elevated as the South African language?
Yeah, I mean, to be frank here, they could have decided their level of ignorance in this case was so high. They could have decided to use Zulu for the same reasons, but it happened to be Afrikaans, and that brings along with it a lot of baggage that may have been less so the case with Zulu. Now, the reality is that out of our entire population, let's say roughly between 50 and 60 million, only 20 million people understand Afrikaans, understand and or speak Afrikaans. The rest don't. So automatically what Ryanair achieved here, instead of finding out who does not have the right passport, they deselected people who don't understand Afrikaans. And that could have happened to 35 million, anybody in a total pool of 35 million people who do not understand the language. One shouldn't use any single language in this way, not even English. Ideally, they should have gone, if they wanted to use a common knowledge test as a way to determine nationality, they should ideally have done it in a multilingual way, i.e. using different languages or a mix of languages, depending on where they are and who they're dealing with. Now, what disturbs me was two things. Well, maybe start with the first one. It's a pity that it's necessary for Ryanair to think of ways in which to discover whether somebody is flying on a false South African passport. Why is that the case? It means that we have problems at the Department of Home Affairs.
Yeah.
That is becoming serious. It's affecting our image abroad. The second was that it mobilized, it hurt people who had a negative experience in the past with Afrikaans. So anybody who in the past was involved in a situation with Afrikaans speaking people or with the language in a way that hurt them, this was all mobilized as a result of Ryanair. Now, obviously, Afrikaans speakers today, or the Afrikaans Language Council for that matter, had no control over this. The company decided what they wanted to do. They refused any communication. They didn't respond to our letters. We complained directly to them. So it was outside of our control. And yet, let's say you were a student in 76 and you were injured. You're going to come to this experience with that baggage. It's not just a neutral, it's not going to be a neutral experience.
Yeah.
So that's the one thing. It mobilized the baggage attached to Afrikaans. The second thing it did, however, is it also mobilized a lot of negative sentiment about Afrikaans that amounted to a stigmatization of the language.
In what way?
Well, for example, a lot of incorrect statements were made, such as that it ignored the reality of Afrikaans as a language that is spoken by a wide diversity of people. It gave a very black and white picture of Afrikaans.
Okay.
Instead of addressing the reality that the majority of the speakers of Afrikaans are not white. They are black, colored, and Indian, literally the majority. So it is, it was portrayed as a language that...
It would be interesting if you could give us the numbers in terms of percentage.
The numbers. Well, yes, there are roughly 7.6 million mother tongue speakers of Afrikaans. And
7 million.
That,
7 million.
7.6 million, yes.
Mm.
And of that, roughly 3.5, 3.7 thereabouts are colored or black or Indian.
So basically 50%. That sounds like 50%.
More than 50. So it's more than 50% of the speakers of the language are not Afrikaners by any stretch of the imagination.
Mm.
The second point is that many statements were made about the origins of Afrikaans and how it is somehow tainted by its origin. And the reality is that it is an indigenous language that was first spoken by the Khoi. Khoi Afrikaans was the first form of Afrikaans spoken even before the Dutch set up their station in the Cape. So by the time that they set up that settlement there, Khoi Afrikaans was already being spoken. It became the language of trade, just like Swahili became the language of trade between people. So the notion of Afrikaans as the settlers' language is also incorrect, completely incorrect.
It would be interesting, though, to see how it's changed. You know, I can imagine that if, you know, how I suppose maybe you can say that it probably still exists in parts of Cape Town, closer to the original way that the Khoi used it as a language of trade.
Yeah, look, if you Afrikaans has a number of varieties that have their roots in this Khoi Afrikaans. One of which is what we call, or what is called Cape Afrikaans, which should not, it is not the same thing as today's COPs, but it's an ancestor of COPs, but also an ancestor of other other varieties of Afrikaans. But we're digressing a little bit, I think. The point is that what really struck me about the Ryanair story is that negative sentiment about Afrikaans that went out across the entire world came from fellow South Africans. There were, of course, journalists who just dug up old stereotypes about the language. But in the main, the sentiment that really got carried out there came from other South Africans, and it re-stigmatized Afrikaans across the world. So for me, that means that what we really need here is a discussion. There needs to be a discussion between the speakers of Afrikaans in their full diversity and the speakers of the other indigenous languages. We're already engaging with the Khoisan languages, but there's definitely a need for talking to one another, for the speakers of the African languages and the speakers of Afrikaans to sit down and talk, and to so that we can deal with misconceptions about the language, and sort things out.
So in a sense, this highlighted South African issues actually, rather than anything else. And in other words, it exposed whether it's what's happening with our situation in the international, like our perception, how we're being perceived in terms of like what's happening with the trade, with travel and fake passports, and at the same time our own internal issues regarding our perceptions among each other and each other's languages. So in a sense, you can also say it's a positive thing, because then it enables one to assess how better to really advocate for this equality in language, in South African languages, right? Because if you don't know what the perceptions are and how vast and wide they are, then you can't really deal with them. And in one sense, one can say it's not really tainting the image of Afrikaans, but actually it's kind of creating a new opportunity for South African languages in general, because South African official languages in general are in this kind of progressive state where we are trying to engage all the languages to kind of as part of our story in this country, and also part of the international language situation, indigenous language situation, where indigenous languages all over the world are becoming extinct and are being promoted by the UN. So in a sense, I would say what it's really done is kind of assist in the language conversation and elevate it, and that perhaps it's not very negative. How do you feel about that?
Well, it is negative in the sense that many old perceptions about Afrikaans, old out-of-date perceptions about Afrikaans were mobilized. That's clear. So it's never good when a language is stigmatized, and that is one of the consequences of the Ryanair debacle. So Afrikaans was put in a position over which speakers had no control, the consequence of which was that language was dragged through the mud internationally because a company made a very bad decision. It is positive in the sense that one now realizes a discussion is sorely needed. There are emotions on the one hand, which are in people's hearts. One can't deny the emotions. There are also many perceptions, however, about the language, which one can address. one can say, look, it is not correct to say Afrikaans is only the language of oppression, of the language of apartheid, because it was also the language of struggle. It was used as the language of the struggle on Robben Island, University of Robben Island. You would find many colored Afrikaans speakers who were involved in the struggle in those days, who respond who are annoyed when the role of Afrikaans as a language of the struggle is denied. So it's we need to bring out more of that history of the language.
Well, this, I think it's, I mean, you've put us some really important and interesting angles that I think are less known by the South African public. Mm-hmm. And yeah, and I think it's good that if we land it here, but I do think that we need another conversation perhaps with a wider group of people, because I do think that it has highlighted that the Ryanair situation has highlighted all the perceptions about Afrikaans that we need to have a discussion about as a country. And, you know, and I think some people may feel alienated by it and some people are hurt by it, but I see an opportunity really here that allows us to have a conversation that, you know, might have not been as widely had, and people I think may have ignored it. People may have just kind of, you know, thought whatever it is that they think about Afrikaans and then ended it there. But now it's everyone's conversation, because it did affect anyone who's South African with a South African passport if they were traveling overseas.
Yes, no, it certainly does. I think the important lesson, as you say, is that it identified a need for a discussion. We should embrace emotions that derive from past experience, but we should also talk about perceptions.
Yes.
And stigmatization. There's a point at which perceptions and the emotions behind the perceptions become a form of stigmatization, which is not positive. And yes, I think it's unfortunate in the sense that, I don't know whether you know about Neville Alexander, the almost call him the grandfather of multilingualism in South Africa. And you have these Neville Alexander seminars held at UNISA and Stellenbosch and elsewhere every year. He said the fate of the, if I remember correctly, the fate of the African languages depends on what happens to Afrikaans. Meaning, if there's a move back to if you have a university, for example, a bilingual university, Afrikaans English, and you move to an English university in order to become multilingual, i.e. bring in the African languages, you've lost. Once that institution has become English, it's very, very difficult to become a multilingual institution again. So he advocated very clearly an additive approach. So yes, I think perhaps we should have a Neville Alexander discussion at some other stage.
And I think it's you know, it's important that it's in academic spaces, but I think the broader public, yes, you know, would really benefit, like the ordinary people that are not in academic circles or specialize in linguistics.
Yes,
because now language has really become, in South Africa, something that's becoming more and more topical. And to quote an article in the Mail and Guardian earlier this week, when it was commenting about commenting about Judge Maya and the chunk of time that was spent on language, discussing language, because she was also being challenged for writing in Xhosa, which is interesting, again, because the person was almost kind of assuming that they should only write in English to include everyone, or write in all 11 languages, which is something else, However, this journalist wrote in the Mail and Guardian this week that, just to quote, it says, the amount of time dedicated to Maya's decision to write the judgment in isiXhosa during Monday's interview is indicative that language is and will be one of the most pressing future issues. So I just thought that was a really, really interesting statement there. Is from someone who's not coming from a language institution to write.
I'd go so far as to say that first, there has been an underlying groundswell of interest in language in South Africa. And that this statement, this very prominent statement by Judge Maya, may well be the moment that turns that groundswell into a movement. She has lent immense impetus to language in our society. Ironically, coming from a very, very English profession.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Conrad Steenkamp. I'll mention that you're a doctor so that people know. That's why you are quoting people like Neville that someone else might not know. So thank you so much for this conversation, and I'm looking forward to a wider discussion. And I'm really going to do my best to make sure that we have a wider conversation, because earlier this year we did have a discussion with filmmakers, and one of the filmmakers from Cape Town went as far as to make a statement that I thought would be seen as very radical in South Africa. She said, Afrikaans is a Black language. And that was the first time I came across that statement, and I thought it was very radical. All right.
Well, it is, the reality of Afrikaans is that it's diverse. So if you say it is a Black language, you mean different things by saying that.
I think what she meant was because she is a descendant of people from slavery. Yeah. And so she, and you also mentioned the Khoi origins of it, and therefore she's affirming that statement and said, yes, I think we should leave it at that, and then we can start the next discussion some other time with that question.
Okay. That's a good idea.
All right. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Siki.
Right. Bye.
That's fine.